thank you to Anna Bradford for that brilliant opening. I'm lucky to have a panel with me that I hope can connect to that. I think we all took quite a lot of learnings from her opening speech. So now, thank you for joining us at this flagship event of the Center for Future Generations. It's incredibly exciting to be here. As I was already introduced, I'm the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the European Correspondent. I'll be moderating through this session. And we'll be talking about how we can get Europe ready to meet the technological and the geopolitical challenges of our time, and specifically how technological and geopolitical readiness intersect. And I think given the super fast developments that were already touched upon by Anu, in AI, in tech, and also security issues, geopolitical fracturing on the continent around the world, this topic could not really be more timely. For a long time, as Anu explained, regulation has been Europe's way to gain influence in the tech space and beyond, through the Brussels effect, through regulating and setting regulatory standards around the world. But if we listen to Draghi, if we listen to Anu, if we listen to others, this is no longer enough. We see supply chain dependencies when it comes to critical raw materials on China. We see that we're not anywhere close to our competitors in building frontier AI models. And major tech companies are still mainly American or other nationalities, and definitely not European. And we also see that these critical raw materials, they're not just used for technology that we use in our phones, but obviously this intersects with our security. We need these materials to build the weapons that should defend us. Meanwhile, research is being done in all kinds of directions when it comes to climate intervention technologies. So the biggest crisis that we're obviously facing at the moment, the climate crisis. And a lot of research is being done in that field, specifically going into geoengineering. And in that, actually, what we'll be also talking about later, we just got a new player that entered, which is an Israeli-run, American-based company, which raised $60 million, if I'm not mistaken, for geoengineering, so for something that could potentially alter the way that the world works. And that seems to now be in the hands, at least partially, of venture capital, so we'll be talking about that. And yeah, I'm super happy to be joined by you three on this topic. Serpil Tasciolu, former director for top sectors and industrial policy at the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs, and previously also worked at Unilever for much time. So you come with a lot of experience both in public and private sector. Jérôme van Biervliet, you're the managing director of the Flemish Institute for Biotechnology, which is a research institute that focuses on strengthening Flemish life sciences, but has a kind of different spin to it, with also going into actually funding research. Cynthia Scarf, you're a fellow at this lovely center that organizes this conference. And before that, you were in the United Nations Secretary General's team negotiating inter alia the Paris Agreement. We'll be touching upon what technologies Europe still has a chance to lead on, what it took to build the success stories that we do have, such as ASML, and how we make sure that we keep track of the climate crisis and we take societies with us in this disruptive era of technologies. Now, there will be a moment for you to ask questions. There's a QR code, so feel free to scan that. That will be at the end. I will take a few questions here. But first, I would like to give the floor to you three for your opening remarks on this topic, your reflections on what Anna Bradford has said, and maybe, Serpil, you want to start?
Okay. Well, I think we need a big mindset shift in Europe. We always talk about catching up, and in that way we create a mindset of play not to lose. And it's a different mindset than as play to win, to lead. And if you look at what is currently the measure of power, it's increasingly about data, algorithms, and technology. Europe has been leading from a moral leadership perspective, respect to human rights, our privacy, and democracy. And that moral leadership will be only symbolic if we are not leading in technology of the future that shapes our future in that respect. So the question is, I think, what we see in front of us is whether we can imagine a future that we progress on technology based on European values, rather than to follow, lead the next era. And with that, create a more leadership mindset, rather than followers.
Thank you. And leadership mindset. Jérôme?
Yes, so obviously I sense very much from the discussion so far the sense of urgency, which I highly applaud. I fully agree with you. I think we have the raw material, let's say, to be leaders. Of course, we have to be smart about it and indeed not just do what the Americans have done. And see what is really hampering us. And I think one of the areas, so biotechnology is really an industry that is very much future-looking, often 10, 15 years in the future, whether it's on sustainable development or on medical progress. And we are actually in a very fortunate space there, where we have the best healthcare in the world. I say that very confidently. If I were a cancer patient, I would much rather be in Belgium than I would be in the US. Because either I need a fortune to get, yes, then very top care, or I would be very poorly treated. So, and have to pay the rest of my life for it. So, but we haven't used this resource for economy creation. We haven't used this resource to get liberal access for research purposes, bona fide research purposes, to develop therapies, to develop diagnostics, to develop digital healthcare solutions, to bring and be able to bring these forward. So that's a big thing which I think we have simply just missed so far, and that has been out of a fear which I hear from players in the field. Oh, but what if ever, you know, a journalist would ask us, we've sold our patient data. Right? As if that is, it reminds me when VIB got started, it was the same thing. Oh, imagine a journalist would ask a research institute, well, you've taken a patent and you've worked with industry, the big bad industry. I mean, of course, that's way behind us. We've created an ecosystem which is, certainly top in Europe and vying for really a place on the global stage with companies like Argenix, for example. But I think the next frontier is to involve the patient in it and to say, because patients want to contribute to research, and so we need a small mind shift there. We have to tell that story. I think, and I like the preceding discussion also on regulation. Yes, there is a lot of regulation, but what we often miss is providing, next to the, let's say, the legislative body, providing a framework, a code of conduct, how to navigate within all that regulation. If you're a small company, how can I navigate this AI and medical regulation and et cetera, such that I remain within the boundaries? Because there's a lot of friction in the system that goes below that. So I think, anyway, with a lot of small tweaks, I think we can change a lot. The final piece, I think, is we really need to liberate capital. I think from all the levers we have, building a much stronger European single market for capital, where venture capital has a decent place, where tech companies can trade publicly on a unified stock exchange, that's going to change the whole landscape, because all the rest will follow. So there's a few ideas there, but anyway, happy to discuss.
Thank you, Jérôme. Cynthia, what are your remarks?
Yes, thank you. Can you all hear me? Great. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I have absolutely no expertise in biotech or the kind of government experience that the other speaker has. But what I've been working on with my colleagues at CFG is solar geoengineering policy, not the scientific research, but how do governments, first of all, become aware of this new technology? How do they think about it? Where do they have conversations on where it should be going? And here I am to defend multilateralism. Now, I know it's seen on its deathbed in pretty much every context, and believe me, I know that because I used to work at the UN, but multilateralism is really the way forward when we're dealing with a technology that, if used at scale, could change the climate of every country in the world, but perhaps not equally. So you can see how many questions might arise from something like this, and the reality is we have no international governance discussions. We have no law, no treaty that says you as government X or you as company Y can put something in the stratosphere that potentially could change the climate. And so that's the work that we're doing, and we're really trying to help people learn about this in totality, not in just a scientific silo or in a multilateral silo, but having those cross-policy, cross-scientific dialogues. So just a few thoughts about what policy needs to entail. First of all, I think in the EU context, there needs to be a balance between a precautionary approach, which is entirely warranted. In fact, that's why I got into this field in the first place. To be quite honest, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified when I read about this back when I was in the UN, even before the Paris Agreement, thinking, this may come to pass. Nobody's got their eyes on it. There's no international rules, guardrails, guidelines about regulating it. So we need to take that precautionary approach very seriously, but we need to add to that preparedness. Because the reality is, at one point, someone or the other is going to announce that maybe they might want to do an outdoor test, let alone a full-scale deployment. And in fact, there is now a commercial company registered in California applying for US IP for some kind of commercial gain on a technology that would entail changing the climate around the world. And to our eyes, that is fundamentally wrong. So we need to take this precautionary approach, but also twin it with preparedness. This is the kind of world we're entering. And I think Anu did a fantastic job of painting what that world might look like. 2 points other than that. We need to see governance evolve, co-evolve with research, so that we're not always playing catch-up, like we did with AI, like we did with social media. What if in 2006, there was some discussion among a broader community about what the potential impact might be on teenagers of social media? If we had had that discussion earlier, perhaps we would not have the tragic statistic of teenage suicides that we're seeing today. So this is a moment to dive into that conversation and make sure that research, perhaps fueled by VCs, isn't zooming ahead and we're playing catch-up yet again in terms of how we might regulate that. 2 other points. While technological readiness is, in fact, an important criteria for geopolitical readiness, it is necessary, but it is far from sufficient. We need to be looking in a holistic lens. And by that, I mean 2 things. 1, environment. We are at a place in humanity's evolution where constraints on the climate, constraints in biodiversity, in water security, in food, and all of those things that are our survival systems are aligned with what we are trying to do with technology. And I won't go into it in detail, but obviously the example here is increase in data centers and compute and the water resources and the energy needed to suffice for that kind of evolution. So we need to look in that broader context. And the last point, something that Anu spoke to very eloquently, is social cohesion. If we endeavor to play with the big boys, to be in the game of technological readiness, we also need to remember that if we make a win, but we don't bring the public along with us, we've lost the battle. The EU is not China, it is not Russia, and it is not the United States. Stand up for those values that have brought the EU together. Stand up for those and remember that technological change is frightening for a great number of people who feel that perhaps that, along with globalization, has left them behind. And when you feel you have no agency in the future, you look for fingers to point at other people, to blame. We need to bring the public along with us, whether that means retraining, greater outreach, greater communication, any of those things. So this is a whole of society evolution, and not just for people like you and me in this room. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. We'll get back to the climate discussion in a little bit. Serpil, I'd first like to begin with you. You said Europe needs a leadership mindset. And when we talk about readiness, a lot always goes back to having actually the resources, hard resources that we need, and that's mainly critical raw materials, which I believe we depend on 90% plus on China, for example, for magnets, which are used for all kinds of technologies. There is a new factory that recently opened up in Estonia that produces those magnets, which is the first time that that happens in Europe. When you talk about a leadership change and this kind of a sense of leadership, how can Europe then scale this up further? And also, how can we do that when we don't even have a unified regulatory body that sort of helps us with that?
Yeah, I think you're very right about our huge dependency on critical raw materials. And on that aspect, I think we have to be also very specific in which materials we mean. And is it a single source or a single country for a critical industry? So I think starting point is hugely important to define first. And I think there are three important points around that. One is we have to see supply chains and materials in a more strategic way, a security angle, strategic dependency angle, than just supply chain. So that's one. Second is, in that sense, we need really smart partnerships. I think the Estonia example is a fantastic one. We need more of that. And see if you can collaborate across Europe between different countries to, for example, aggregate demand. So you can then create more positive business cases to invest in new capabilities in Europe, whether it's about getting more materials in other parts of the regions, or creating more processing units, or on the area of recycling. And that's my third point. Around leadership, Europe has one of the best technologies on recycling. So in that sense, can we take the lead there, where we buy a lot of materials in Europe to make sure that also it stays Europe and reused? So invest really in technologies and innovations in that perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Jérôme, you lead a research institute that also acts as an incubator, so actually fund science that then should go into innovation. What is your advice to policymakers that try to scale up innovation and try to actually find companies that are started in Europe and are not then sold to Americans?
Yes, I think that's been pretty much at the heart of when I was advisor for the Belgian government during the preparation of the Biotech Act, for example, and the Draghi report. We did some thinking around this, of course, looking from my very particular lens. Indeed, we are. There's three big areas. First, we are as good, if not better, and that's what I hear from investors, at the fundamental science, or the foundational science, I'd like to call it. Actually, we typically undersell, or we're much more pragmatic about our results than the Americans are. So that is great, but it gets stuck. Across Europe, there's a few hubs, and we believe we are one of them, but there's many hubs where this science does not get out into startups. So that's a big area we need to work on. It's clearly on the agenda of the European Commission, and there's very practical things we can do there. But let me skip to the second piece, and that's the funding landscape. I mean, if you talk early venture capital, in biotechnology, we are dependent on venture capital. It's a capital-intensive industry. There's no way around it. It's in early stage, it's about threefold difference. In late stage, it's about a fivefold difference. On the stock market, it's a sevenfold difference. And then if you sell your company, it's anywhere between 3 to 4 times higher valuation. So if you're an investor, I mean, these numbers are simply not able to, that means we're still done pretty well in the early stages. There's been a nice growth over the years, but later stage has been a total disaster, and that's indeed what happens. Because if you're a company, you need this capital to keep going, so you need to look where the capital is. And so that's where I believe, I come back to my, a little bit the opening statement, I think the most actionable lever the European Commission or Europe as a whole is actually these capital markets. And that's also why, indeed, we have taken initiatives on our own, bottom up. We've started already 4 funds that we don't run necessarily. We start them, and then it's like a startup, and they go. Some in pre-seed, some in early stage, and then some in the growth stage is coming, and that's going to be big news in the sector. But that's the type of initiative we need to take. And I think through that initiative, we also see where very practically Europe can change a few things, relatively minor things. And I think the asymmetry was already mentioned. I think that's a key thing. We need to work with coalition of willing member states for which this is an important topic. And then for example, also on financial regulators, liberating more capital from pension funds to investments in this type of area. That will require a mind shift a bit. But actually, if we can create the conditions where money goes around, there will be successes also. That's what the US ecosystem clearly showed in the graph. But it's risk-taking, obviously. But I do think, actually, European investors are interested in funding biotech, because actually, if you look at companies that are dual-listed, both in Europe and in US, up to 30 or 40% of their liquidity, of their trading, actually comes from European institutional investors. So that says if you have a good stock market, have you a good ecosystem, there will be interest to invest. So that's a big area, I think. The final area is indeed, again, regulation. Obviously, in the medical space, rightfully so, it's very, it's heavily regulated, but always out of a hazard principle. And especially in the sustainability space, for example, just imagine if you have to regulate against any possible hazard, rather than taking into account the risk-benefit. It's always, let's just avoid that no journalist ever says you allowed something on the market which, in some field somewhere had some, there is a bit of an overreach there, especially if you look at it combined, the European level, and then the way that gets implemented on the national level. And again there, if we could combine, if we could align, I always say as a boutade, they say in French, as almost a joke, if a therapy is good enough in Denmark, it should be good enough in Belgium, right? There's no reason why a Belgian administrator should have different requirements than the Danish ones, or vice versa, right? There are still large socioeconomic differences within the whole of Europe, but at least let's try and find countries which are similarly willing to pay, as they say it, and align, because that, especially for the innovative companies, the smaller companies, this would make a huge opportunity. Right now, we have a situation where we have biotech companies bringing therapies to the market with US capital. They launch in the US first, then they launch in Japan, then they launch in Canada, and then maybe they will take one at the 27 member states, each at a row, to get finally to the market. And so patients here are waiting for solutions from companies they see next door. And so, which is, I think that's really an issue. I also want to say, I don't think that the problem is at the European level. The problem is at the member state level. And there, unfortunately, we have a lot of political tensions as well that don't go that way. But like was said before, we need to give some sovereignty to the European level on specialized domains. That's the other piece. Please focus on, don't make, a framework for everything. Stock markets, for example. Talk about technology companies only, and don't talk about the banks that are, on the stock market or all these other industries. Talk about deep tech and biotech specifically, because they are very different.
And those are technologies where Europe still has a chance to lead?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at Mistral. Look at, there's many in the deep tech. There's absolutely potential. But we just need to make it happen. And I think we need to, the financial regulators in that case, for example, have to look at this and say, this is not a company, give me a top line and a bottom line. No, I'm going to be burning cash for so many years until finally I will make the point of break even. That's the reality. But if we want to be this, and if we create those environments and talk to people about it, people will allocate a portion of the capital they have to invest to this type of initiatives. And then it will not all be the 7, the mega companies that we saw, because that's what's happening now. And so we can capture some of that capital that's being invested then in some of our own, let's say, European companies. Anyway, many things to do, but I think, we can definitely get there.
Now, separately, there's one company that stands out, which is from your country, the Netherlands, which also has elections today. ASML, chip maker, semiconductor company, and I think that globally stands out. It's the only one that produces its product at scale. What worked? Why did that happen? What lessons can we learn from the success of ASML, and can that be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic example of Europe leading on the very frontier of technology. So in that sense, ASML and obviously many other companies in the Netherlands on the semiconductor sector, particularly in the equipment side, are leading. And if you look back in the history of it, actually it was a technology being actually disposed by Philips because they didn't really believe in it, and then a joint venture was created with ASM and Philips, and at the end also Ministry of Economic Affairs actually gave subsidies, and that was about 30, 40 years ago, about that they believed that it could through that joint venture be developed. And if you look at the evolution of it, there were really brilliant scientists behind it. Brilliant scientists that got educated in also our fantastic universities in Europe. What you also see is it has been connected to a lot of ecosystems. So with a lot of suppliers, they were able to develop edge technologies. I mean, just a few examples. They collaborated with ZEISS on technology in Germany, where they created a one-on-one relationship that they created really the edge of technology on that. With Trump is another company in Germany, but also with a Dutch family company called VDL, where they have been collaborating. So they created an open ecosystem of collaboration with suppliers, taking joint risks. There were brilliant entrepreneurs behind it that were taking huge risks, but also taking the courageous steps to acquire certain technologies, also from US. And if you look also behind it, is that, yeah, I think there were many success factors that defined the success of a company like ASML. So the ecosystem, the capital behind it, the brilliant scientists, and also the entrepreneurs behind it. And I think Europe will succeed to support this type of companies beyond capital. So it's about courage, it's about conviction, it's about, again, the leadership to think beyond like yourself, that you think, okay, I really want to go to the next level. So I think it's a brilliant example of innovation and continue to lead in that era.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I want to pitch into that, because I think you're absolutely right. And I think the other thing that this company clearly emanates, but also some others do as well, is to not think in a project-like way. We in Europe, we think too much, oh, I'm going to take this project, I'm going to bring it there, and somebody's going to buy it. At least in my sector, that's very much prevalent. Sometimes that's the case, right? Obviously. But actually, this cannot be a strategy. The strategy is to build a great company. And you build an ecosystem for the long term. And if you get bought along the way, okay, that may happen. But it's a totally different mindset. And that's clearly what the ASML example illustrates. But there's many examples in the biotech sphere as well. And companies like Genmab, companies like Argenx, they're not developing a product. Many products. They are developing a company which can really make the difference for patients through products, of course. But it's and it's often not the very first project or product they start. It's actually the third or the fourth or the fifth that makes the big headways. Yeah. So I absolutely resonate with that.
I'd like to go to you, Cynthia. In your opening statement, you said how you focus on climate interventions and kind of the limits that the environment now imposes on us that maybe weren't as clear as before. Antonio Guterres, for example, just said in a Guardian interview before COP that the world will not reach the 1.5 degree goal, building up on what experts before have already concluded. Kind of naive question, and I know that we had discussed this before the panel. Is there at all hope that technologies will save us? Or is that at all the right framing when we talk about technologies when it comes to climate?
Before I dive into that question, I just wanted to put in a few comments about the importance of research on climate interventions. Right now, the total amount of funding that has gone into this field is under $200 million over a decade globally. That is really quite a small amount. So imagine what happens when a company that has received 60 million in VC funding appears on the stage. You can see how that would be skewed. So having some legitimacy on the evolution of research requires that there be public funders as well. Not as a subsidy, but as a statement of legitimation, saying we need to know more about this technology, both the risks, but also the possible benefits. So I just wanted to add that into my previous comments. So, the hope question. For 15 years, I've been asked the hope question, 15 years that I've worked on climate change. And everybody wants me to answer in a certain way. And so you all know what you want to hear. I'm not going to meet your expectations. I don't think we can change the law of physics. We have gone too far in terms of the aggregate amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Even the development of something like solar geoengineering has enormous risks as well as potential benefits. And there the challenges are in the governance sphere, in human nature, not physical sciences. So I'm not going to answer what you'd like me to say on the hope question. But we named our daughter Hope. It's a really important value in my family. So I don't take the question lightly, and you deserve an answer. My answer is this: I think you have the wrong question. I think it's much more about courage. It's much more about collaboration. And it's much more about compassion. So courage to see things as they are. I'm glad the SG at the United Nations has now come out and said what scientists have been saying kind of behind the scenes for quite some time, that we have surpassed the temperature limit that was laid out in the Paris Agreement. And the reality is we're going to move to twice that. At least that's the BAU trajectory that we are on now, to almost 3 degrees Celsius rise, which is catastrophic by any stretch of the imagination. It's not extinction. It will be for thousands of species other than the human race, but it's pretty catastrophic. So courage to say what the science has said, courage to let our decisions be driven by the science and not by ideology. Second of all, collaboration. We need the best minds in the entire world to be working on this problem because it is the world's problem. It is not one country's. And unlike the United States, where our president right now feels like his decisions can roll back all that progress that we've made, which is important, still not sufficient, but vitally important. This is a global problem, regardless of what the United States says or does right now. And so we need the best minds from within disciplines to be talking with each other and across borders. Lastly, it's about compassion. Do we have the compassion, the empathy to understand how countries that have done very, very little to cause climate change are getting hit first and worst by its impacts? So when we think about technologies that might ameliorate in the immediate term some of that suffering, that is the goal of solar geoengineering. Whether or not that's even possible, that is the goal. We need to be thinking about the people who usually aren't in this room, the people who are hurt first and worst. They need to be part of the conversation about how we might regulate that kind of technology, whether we should do research, what kind of research, but we need to bring them along. And so addressing climate change, we're not looking for a solution because there is no one solution. And solar geoengineering is never a solution because it doesn't address the cause of the problem. And I won't go into that right now. But we need to be hearing from the people who are already suffering, who did the very least to cause this problem in the first place. So I'm not going to give you the answer you want to hear about hope, but I am going to say it takes courage, it takes collaboration, and it takes compassion.
Thank you. Now, I will stay with you. I also see there's quite a few questions from all of you, so we'll get to those now. But you talked in your opening statement about how social media use has increased suicide rates. One question that I've got from Gwen was that longitudinal data was not there 10 years ago to make that decision, to make that prediction reliably. So how can we then make laws that prevent or anticipate this when it's very difficult to have that kind of data when we deal with technologies that are only now emerging? I mean, 5 years ago, I don't think I could have imagined that I can create a whole video with just the prompt. Yeah. So how can we regulate that better?
I think two factors would help. One is kind of cross-disciplinary discussions at the early stage. So a problem isn't just about the physical sciences. You bring in the social sciences as well. You bring in the artistic, the creative community to think about a problem and what its advantages might be, what some of the downsides might have been. You bring in perhaps mental health experts. You bring all of those to the table. Second, I'd like to put in a plug for foresight, for thinking through potential scenarios of what might happen. And we at CFG are very lucky to have as one of our partners from the ARIA grant we received from the UK government, to have the OECD and the benefit of some of the world's best foresight to come and work with us to help us think through what scenarios might be, because we don't have the answers. What we can do is think about potential implications, cross-disciplinary-wise, and what might happen in terms of a scenario.
Can I maybe add to this? I heard an interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And I think also we need to talk to the people who actually developed social media. For example, I recently heard one of the inventors of a technology we use every day, probably at the moment, the scrolling technology. So that's actually I wasn't aware, but it's a software invention where you can scroll endlessly. And so he basically stepped out of the world because he's seen what it's doing, indeed, to vulnerable populations. He said simply, if you were able to regulate and delay the scrolling, if you look on certain types of content, just provide this extra milliseconds for us all to be scrolling, oh shit, this is not going so well. Right, exactly. This event, that would actually make you think, activate your brain to say, actually, what am I doing? I'm just wasting my time here on stuff that I shouldn't be looking at, or the stuff that hasn't been validated. So I think, other than upfront regulating everything for the future, it's almost a management question, because things evolve so rapidly. And right now, let's be honest, the decisions are only made at in the boardroom based on profit numbers. That's it.
For you, Sepil, a question from Thomas Lingard.
Oh.
There's a difference between policy and regulation, but Brussels uses the term often interchangeably. What policies, so not regulations, do you think would support the growth of Europe's technological readiness?
Yeah. Great question, Thomas. Thank you.
I don't know. There you are.
I think, look, what I see in my experience, as I've done both private sector and public sector, and the Dutch government, but I also worked with Brussels, particularly on the semiconductor coalition. Because I felt the pace of change of technology is faster than the policymakers can catch up. So in that sense, regulation takes indeed more time because it has to go through multiple processes as well as parliaments and so on. But you can also think about new ways of partnerships and coalitions. So what we did with, for example, Semiconductor Coalition is that what I've seen from my Dutch work is that every country was doing their own semiconductor strategy. So it wasn't really laddering up to an overall European capability. And although, for example, CHIPS Act has been a huge political signal about being an important strategic sector for Europe, we were still not not leading in the globe. And if you want to compete between different continents like China, US, you need to act as a European level rather than country by country. So what we said is, okay, we need a common European strategy, a common way of how we build capabilities and not duplicate everywhere the same, because then you don't strengthen your core capability. So I said to the Commission, so I'm happy as the Netherlands to help you to accelerate the CHIPS Act 2 revision. So we started with a 9-country coalition which got political support. So all the 9 ministers of 9 countries, including Germany and France, not least, who signed up for this coalition, that we would create a joint strategy for Europe. And then we got 27 countries in a few months behind this. And actually last week the Commission has announced that they would be fast-tracking now the CHIPS Act, but we already said at the time with other countries that we have to attract investment. So you can to work with private sector to ensure that they invest. Second is when you do your public investments, for example, that you also do complementary R&D investments, because that is kind of the influence sphere of governments where they put their R&D money. So in that way, it's really thinking differently than only regulation, because to the point of the discussion just now, is, and maybe that goes back to the initial discussion also around the regulation in Europe, is what is the outcome that we try to achieve, and do we need regulation for that, or is this a different type of partnership or an investment or something else that we need? So I think that discussion needs to take more in place. What's the outcome that you want to achieve?
Talking about outcome and regulations, one question from Onur Çevik. As climate intervention technologies advance, are there inspiring practices within the EU's regulatory framework and model that could ensure that these technologies are developed responsibly? Do you see any of that? For all of you, but...
Well, I think, like I would actually, the example, I think, for example, our institution, we are dependent on public funding. Right? So we are a non-profit organization, but in the way we act and the way we engage with the private sector is very much like a partner. So we are an in-between. We are called in Belgium a strategic research center, but actually my role is actually to build the ecosystem and to be involved in those discussions. We are on the boards of companies. We are, of course, biotech companies, not, but some of them work on climate change subjects. And so, for example, on sustainability, biotech has a lot to offer towards sustainable solutions in production, chemistry, alternatives, food, you name it. There's many things that actually living organisms can do for us. And so we launched an incubator program, for example, as a little, gem to say, okay, you know what, we need to seed more for a few to emerge and become the next ASML, hopefully someday. So I think that's I think what governments, it's perhaps not regulation exactly what the question was about, but at least the public sector can do, is to seek out organizations that can interact. I think the TNO network is similar in the Netherlands, where it's not, academic top science research can be combined with, strategic importance sectors and involvement. On the regulatory front, I would hope actually we could do the same. Like I said, I've been involved in this draft, or well, in let's say at least some of the discussions around the Biotech Act. And there, to be honest, I sense from the regulator's point of view a lot of hesitancy to actually be able to discuss draft solutions that they think about from their consultation with the sector. I think I don't know, maybe I'm not sufficiently aware, but there seems to be a barrier there where they can listen, but they cannot actually bounce an idea, which that's how brainstorming works. If we would be brainstorming, I would bounce an idea and you'd say, oh, no, you haven't thought about this, or that's how you get to a solution. But for some reason, I have the impression political or policy makers have I don't know, maybe there's a rule or something, I don't know, or it's just a code of conduct that they're too afraid of letting people look in their cards, let's say, for something that's still draft. But that's actually what needs to happen. We need to not just say, like in these fora, this is what we need, but actually show me how you now interpreted what we just told you. So that we can say, you know what, actually I would do it that way. Oh, it would be much smarter this way. That. You know, that's what I mean. Like this example of this scrolling. That's something that people are happy to provide to regulators. If people scroll for, you know, bad content for teenagers, you know, the anorexia stories are abound. Well, just slow down the scrolling pace to the point where, you know, people just like...
Becomes annoying, yeah.
Right, it gets annoyed. And that's it. And if they do better, well, then, you know, you can get better. So you create an incentive. Anyway, it's perhaps, I don't know if that's exactly the question, but hopefully some thoughts for...
Other thoughts on good practices within EU regulation that could help us?
Yeah, I think the public-private engagement is hugely critical. What I experience also in that work is that the worlds are quite separate. So business leaders have different KPIs, different time horizons, different ways of expressing things. And sometimes they also are really trying to understand how it works in, for example, with regulators, whether it's a national government or in Brussels. And on the other hand, I've also seen on the public side that also the language is different, the time horizon is different, the way of decisions are being made is different. So I think we need more translators in between.
Absolutely, I agree.
To help to bridge that gap, because I think what I experience, at least in my public work, is that public servants are very keen to understand this and trying to really do the right thing.
Absolutely.
But also they realize that they're under huge scrutiny. Because whatever you do, you can be criticized publicly or in the media, particularly the politicians. So in that sense, always being careful in that sense. So I think we need to find a way, because I think if you want to create successful policy, then you need private sector input. But on the other way, the private sector can create much more impact from a business and society perspective if they connect better with public servants.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe one idea I've also bounced is that we probably need a European institution for regulatory innovation, at least in the medical space. Like think about experiment in sandboxes or in, you know, we did it during COVID, right? During COVID, suddenly, you know, medicine's approval is a very regulated process, but suddenly actually things that would be unheard of otherwise, you wouldn't even try, now suddenly were possible because of the crisis. So in the sustainability space, it's the same. I mean, the crisis is there. Why don't we have the same sense of urgency to say, you know what, when we approve a biological crop protection agent, if any of you have eaten fruit flies by accident, because they were sitting on your banana, you would have had this compound in you, right? That's some of those compounds we can use for crop protection. Well, actually, I know a company who's been waiting for 8 years, to know how this is going to be regulated to finally get this approved. I mean, this is not, obviously, this is not working, right? So we need to be able, the crisis that is imminent doesn't justify the hazard thinking of let's just avoid any possible, you know, perceived or real effect of small or big size, that all of that discussion is gone, right? It's about, so I think we will need technologies. CRISPR, for example, is the biggest revolution. We need CRISPR to develop the drought-tolerant crops. We need it. Right now, we are still in limbo. It's moving the right direction, but we need to protect the innovators. Now there's a discussion on patenting it, which makes no sense whatsoever, because actually we need innovators. You need to attract capital. You will have to have IP protection. And if we don't do it, it's very clear. Farmers in Spain, as of 2030, will have basically no other resource to either stop or get crops from China and the US that are drought tolerant. It's as simple as that. So the public literacy and public mindset also needs to shift.
Yeah. We are already over time, but the other session also went over time. So we're going to wrap up now, and I have one last question for each of you. That also came from one of the audience members. What will you put your energy and your efforts into in the short to medium term, and how can people help? maybe Serpil, you want to start?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I had really the pleasure to work both on the private and the public side and to share my experiences there and to also engage where we can jointly make our next level of impact for Europe and for our society. So that would be my focus.
Wow, so many things to do in this field. It's just emerging. But one is obviously raising awareness further with policymakers here in the EU and those who advise them. But beyond that, looking at different partnerships that we're setting up with some of the countries that are in the EU, but also some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, to try and bring all voices to this conversation, because there is no easy answer at all. So bringing those voices in and trying to chart a way forward in terms of what might be needed with regulating research.
Well, for us, of course, we will keep doing what we're doing in the sense that we advance science and bring it into the ecosystem. But on the higher level, like I said, from these priorities, which I really am quite passionate about, Europe's competitiveness, I think we need to work on the capital markets as the biggest, most impactful lever, which is likely easier than some of the other domains, or at least, it should be high enough on the priority. But let's, make sure we specialize it to innovative tech companies and not drag in everybody else, like the whole economy, because then it becomes very political. So that's going to be, some of the things we'll be working on.
Thank you very much. Thank you three, and thank you for being here. And now we'll move on to the next panel.